Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are picking back up again with the Swords of X event, and this sees the return of one of my favorite villains of all time in the history of Marvel Comics. You guys know exactly who I'm talking about. The downside of this is we see him once. That's all we get. So what we initially have here is an emissary, right? An invitation to a contest of worlds. Basically saying, we invite you to see the battle between the forces of Arakko and the forces of Krakoa. Now, a lot of you guys have kind of been wondering, or at least kind of expressed a little bit of confusion in terms of what's going on here. To kind of sum this all down, the nature of what's going on with X of Swords, or I guess 10 of Swords, whatever you want to call it. The whole reason why this is taking place is because Apocalypse, when he opened the gate, the external gate that basically allows access between Krakoa and Otherworld, his goal was to use that gate to access Arakko to rescue his wife and his children, the Four Horsemen, and then bring them back to Krakoa and basically unite his family. What he ended up discovering, and what we discovered, is that what you also had going on were called the Forces of Ammon. And the Forces of Ammon managed to breach their own realm, and then eventually they were taken over by the Four Horsemen. So the Four Horsemen lead the army of Ammon, and so when Apocalypse entered Otherworld with the intention of reuniting his family, that he discovered his family had basically become bad guys, right? Like his kids basically became villains, and they were leading this army, and they intended to basically use the Krakoan gate that granted access to Otherworld to pass through that gate into Krakoa and then conquer Krakoa and the rest of the world, right? So it's kind of like, you know, I want to get my kids back. Oh my God, they're villains. And the whole reason why this matters is because in order to settle the affair, right? In order to basically keep like all out war between the forces of Krakoa and the forces of Arakko emerging, Saturnine basically created this contest, right? Created this whole great big huge tournament, and whoever wins will be the one who decides, or who kind of gets what it is that they want, right? So if the Four Horsemen, if Apocalypse's kids win the tournament, then they lead the army of Ammon into Krakoa. If the forces of Krakoa win, then the army of Ammon, whatever happens to them, happens to them. And that's why we are where we are right now. So just a quick little synopsis, kind of a quick explanation. I get that some of you guys are a little confusing. It's the nature of going through Jonathan Hickman's work kind of piece by piece, is that it's one of these things where he reads much better in trade. It's much better to read Jonathan Hickman's stories when it's all done and you go and you get the trade paperbacks, right? It makes everything make a lot more sense. But the emissary has basically appeared here to Mad Jim Jaspers in the Crooked Market, right? And basically saying, this is your invitation to show up here to this tournament to become a part of it, right? To kind of watch everything unfold. And that's the last time we see Jim Jaspers in this comic. But here's the funny thing about this, right? Here's the funny thing about what Hickman's going to end up doing here. Jonathan Hickman with Mad Jim Jaspers, it could go one of two ways, right? We could see Mad Jim Jaspers pop off. We could see him just lose his mind and this crazy display of power in the next issue. We may not see him again for another 5 issues, right? It could be that we see him in like the background during the whole tournament, and then we don't actually see him do anything for another 50 issues. There's no telling with Jonathan Hickman, right? We have no idea. Jonathan Hickman writes for the long game, right? He writes for the conclusion of the story. So it's kind of the nature of the beast, right? It's the nature of these things. And so because of that, the next thing is that the emissary visits the kingdom of Sevalith, and then of course visits the Infuri at the Everforge. Now, the Infuri and really the Fury themselves, the fact that there's more than one is kind of terrifying. The Fury are wildly powerful beings, right? So to kind of give you guys a little bit of an explanation here, when Mad Jim Jaspers originally appeared in Marvel Comics, he was part of a universe called Earth 238, and this was a universe where he basically killed all the superheroes. But Jim Jaspers didn't do it on his own. Instead, what he did is he used his powers to warp reality to create the Fury. And the Fury was a being that had the ability to adapt to anybody's powers and then overcome them. It's how the Fury was able to defeat Jim Jaspers from the main Marvel universe when the Fury showed up inside the main Marvel universe, or at least the first time the Fury killed him. The two of them actually ended up coming back. There's a story that we haven't covered called X-Men Die by the Sword, I think, where Jim Jaspers comes back. But the whole idea here is that the Fury realized that the only way that Jim Jaspers' powers work is if he has a universe to alter. And so he took him to where the Earth 238 universe was at before it was destroyed, and then basically obliterated him, right? Because he realized that in this giant empty space where there is no matter, that Jim Jaspers is powerless, right? So the fact that there's like an entire place here full of Furies is kind of nuts. They are weapon forgers. They create like these basically like these unbreakable weapons in all of reality, like in the entirety of the multiverse. Because remember, what we're dealing with here are multiversal locations. People from different universes can access these different places. Like the Crooked Market, Apocalypse from like, you know, the Age of Apocalypse universe could access this, and like characters from like the Days of Future Past universe could access this. Feasibly, if they decided to include it, the Marvel Cinematic Universe Doctor Strange could travel to this place, right? It's kind of bonkers. So we're dealing with things on a much larger scale. These aren't planets. These are whole universal territories, right? Little pocket dimensions. You've also got the Holy Republic of the Fae. You've got the floating kingdom of Roma Regina. This is basically Merlin and Roma. They were previously the ones who ruled over Otherworld before the events of the incursions, the death of the whole Captain Britain Corps, and the fact that they just kind of ended up going to war with each other. But in their absence, it allowed Saturnine to take over control of Otherworld, and that's why she is where she is. But nonetheless, following these kind of emissaries, or this emissary that's sent out and these invitations that are given to these various people, we pick up with what are called the Foul and Fair Courts. And this is basically a kind of coming together of these various courts, some of which we see here and some of which we don't. For example, you don't see Jim Jaspers here, who's considered part of the Foul Court, probably because he's just like, I have other things to do besides show up here. You see the Furies who are here, they're considered part of the Fair Court. Hickman doesn't really play it solid insofar as saying the Fair Court are good guys, the Foul Court are bad guys. We're not really given a kind of knockdown explanation that way. We can kind of assume maybe it is, but historically Merlin is a dick, and the fact that he's part of the Foul Court kind of makes sense. But Roma's been a little, weird too sometimes, and so there's been a few times where she's been a little bit villainous in her actions, and so again, it kind of seems to follow that ideology, but again, we're not given like an actual definitive explanation here. Instead, the whole purpose behind the assembling of this court is basically for the Blight Spokes to be allowed access across like any of the dimensions that they want to. Now, we're not really given a whole lot of information about the Blight Spoke, and in fact, this is all we really seem to see of them, right? You got Sheriff Gia Whitechapel of the Blight Spoke, and that's really it. Their request is denied, and that's really all you get here, but it's a little bit of kind of a court thing. But the reason why Hickman does this is because this will be important later on down the line, right? That's the reason why he gives us this. And so for the most part, we can kind of take this little bit of a scene, we can sit it on the back burner and then come back to it at a future point in time. But the important thing to kind of come out of this is that at the conclusion of this meeting, essentially, you end up having Saturnine, who asks the current horsemen who were there, like Pestilence and War, are your Araco forces currently prepared to engage in this conflict? And their answer is yes. And then of course she asks Jamie Braddock, what about your forces on Krakoa? And he's like, they're on their way, right? So basically, this is a coming together of the warriors, right? They're all basically arriving in Otherworld, and then the tournament will commence after that, right? And so what we end up doing here is transitioning to Krakoa and Apocalypse talking to all the sword bearers, right? And he gives like the worst speech ever. He's like, okay guys, don't die, because if you do, then you're gonna come back in some weird twisted version. All right, let's go. And that's basically it. And instead, the statement's kind of like, you should kind of give us a little bit of like a pep talk, right? It's like literally, like Cable's like, can you it couldn't hurt, right, if you give us some kind of a pep talk? And so he does. And it's actually this epic pep talk, right? He says like, sword bearers, most of you are mutant. You have tasted the sweetness of immortality and evolution of our people, meaning the fact that they can die and always come back. Now we step into the other world where all realities are one, and your defeat will mean the death of Krakoa, the death of this earth, and the death of you, as you are now, never to return. So when you draw your sword, you must not fight like a human who stands to lose a few years of toil, but like a mutant who stands to lose forever in paradise. For if you do not, you will not be the first immortals I will have watched die. It's a crazy, it's a really, really cool thing. Like, it's a pretty epic speech, right? It's a pretty awesome speech there. And so what we end up doing is picking up with these various forces of Krakoa and Araco all showing up here, right? And initially it starts with Captain Britain showing up here along Wolverine, Cable, so on. They all basically teleport in at the same time. But when they do, it's kind of like, okay, like they're immediately on their guard, right? Because they don't know if they're teleporting in here and then the battle immediately starts. They don't know if they're teleporting in here and there's going to be a lot of pomp and circumstance, right? A great big huge kind of procession, or kind of welcome to the 10 of X event, and so on and so forth, and like you got Michael Buffer there, in this side of the ring, standing at 5'2", weighing some ridiculous number because his bones are covered in unbreakable metal, Wolverine. Like, we don't really know if that's what we're gonna get, right? I think it'd be awesome if like Michael Buffer showed up here and offered a kind of speech, right? I think it'd be pretty cool. But Saturnine finally makes her appearance and basically tells everybody, you guys need to chill, right? Like relax. The tournament's not starting yet. It will start soon. Your fellow combatants are going to be arriving here and it'll be a chance for you guys to meet. So head to your quarters. They've all been prepared for you. And when they arrive there, they're all given their respective cards. Remember, these were cards that were created by Saturnine explicitly for them, but the cards do not necessarily mean what they appear to be on their faces. For example, you end up having Cable, who's given the card of of the fool. And it doesn't mean that Cable is an actual fool, even though he thinks that's what it means. Instead, it's the journey of the fool, which is to say he doesn't know everything yet, but he will learn a lot as time goes on. This really kind of seems to be a roundabout way of Jonathan Hickman saying the powers of Cable are going to expand, or Cable's own individual story is going to become a lot more grandiose than it currently is. But then of course you end up having Apocalypse, who reads his, gets angry and throws it away. And so what he ends up doing is traveling to meet Saturnine. And this conversation between these two is wildly intriguing. And that's what makes Hickman's, X of Swords so cool, is because you see characters meeting whom you would never see meet under any other circumstance. And watching how they interact is really intriguing. For example, like Saturnine was never really the most powerful character ever. It wasn't until she took over Otherworld and then started using all the magics at its disposal to utilize, to really rule this place, that she became as powerful as she is. Prior to this, she was basically a figurehead, right? She was the Omniversal Magistrix. She was not on par with like the Living Tribunal or something like that. She just kind of played more of a gubernatorial role in relation to like how the multiverse functions. If you kind of broke it down into different positions, she played more of the governing body. With regards to the Living Tribunal, he played like the power source. Now, neither one really associated with the other. It's not like you would see meetings of the Omniversal Development Court and like the Living Tribunal's out there in the third row watching it all go down. You would never really see that. Instead, it was kind of doing its own thing. It was part of this wildly intricate hierarchy of how the multiverse, how its form and function is maintained. The funny thing about that though is the Omniversal Development Court was sometimes acknowledged and sometimes ignored by Marvel Comics, depending on who the writer was. For example, you hadn't seen it for like, I want to say it didn't appear for like a decade until you got to the Incursions, right? I mean, you had Spider-Man UK and you had a few appearances here and there, but like in those 5 years that Marvel was leading up to Secret Wars, you saw it a multitude of times. Prior to that, you never really saw it at all, right? And you probably wouldn't have known it existed unless you were reading the right kind of comics. And even then, it didn't really appear all that often in Excalibur. So it's one of these interesting things. That's kind of the nature of how it all works. Marvel's never really consolidated it. They never really kind of explained like what's the nature of the Omniversal Development Court in comparison to the Living Tribunal. Does like the one above all, is he part of this? Like was he the one that kind of engineered that? How does it compare to like the Fulcrum and the Neil Gaiman comics for the Eternals? We don't really know, right? We're not really given an explanation here. But with Apocalypse showing up here and basically meeting her, the question is, I don't really like what I'm seeing here, right? Like I don't really like what's going on. I don't really like this game you're playing. Answer me, right? Like what's the meaning of these taunts, of all this nonsense? But notice, Saturnine doesn't really take him seriously. Now, one of the big things about her character, about Saturnine's character historically, is she always had a kind of arrogance, right? There was always a kind of arrogance about her in the sense of, I'm above you. I'm way much higher above you than anybody else is, right? It's just the nature of things. In terms of power, probably not, or at least, before she became ruler of Otherworld, she's nowhere near above Apocalypse. But even Apocalypse plays it a little haughty, right? He's like, answer me before, explain yourself before I become angry. Well, he's literally he's in the lion's den, right? He's in the belly of the beast. What is he gonna do? Like, there's no power he possesses that could overcome Saturnine. I guess maybe he could just start like smashing the Twilight Citadel, right? Just like, smashing his fists and knocking off giant chunks of it and just more or less like inconveniencing her. But that would be about it. That'd be about all that he could do in this situation. But one of the things that she says is she's like, I'm kind of intrigued by you. You really are one of the oldest beings in existence, right? In on your Earth, not across your entire universe, right? Relative to the history of the universe, you're but a speck, right? You've been alive for a fraction of a second. But in terms of the history of your Earth, you've been around for a relatively lengthy amount of time. I mean, even within the history of the Earth, right, it's still kind of a fraction of a second. But in comparison to the evolution of your race, of mutant kind, you've been around for a long, long time. And even in comparison to the length of humanity, you've been around for a pretty lengthy amount of time. But I'm kind of curious about you, right? All this power that you possess, you beat Morgan Le Fay, right, in like a straight up battle. That's interesting. But what you've done here is you've bullied yourself in. You've basically played the role of somebody who's lesser than yourself. And once it was all said and done, the only reason you even got here is because I invited you. So ask yourself the question, is it kind of an insult to know that no matter what your best efforts were, you only got in here because I allowed it? But even kind of continuing this taunting, and even when he says like, are you trying to provoke me? At the end of the day, she still just kind of plays it fast and loose. And she still doesn't really take him seriously. More so than that, she's like, you're a very, very old being. I'm surprised that you're acting so impatient here. You really shouldn't be acting this impatient, right? You've been around long enough. You should have more patience than almost anybody else here. You're playing a game that you've been working on for millennia. And here at the finish line, you're going to suddenly grow impatient. Well, the funny thing about this is that it reveals the very human side of Apocalypse in the sense of course he does. Like, he's just about done. Like, which one of us doesn't find our second win when we're that close to the finish line, right? That's kind of where he is. This kind of new method, this new step of zealousness that's going on with this character. And so with Saturnine, who was already on her way to a meeting, she invites Apocalypse along. And this is one of those things where it seems to be kind of designed to more or less play games. But when he enters into this meeting room, he's met by an individual who is wearing what's basically the helmet of Amenth, the helmet of this demon entity. And as we explained in the last video, those individuals who wear it become the voice of Amenth itself. I really say itself because we don't really know if this demon is like a man or a woman or anything about them whatsoever. But they basically become the person or kind of stand in as the person who's leading this whole force, right? And so this person that she's meeting with is effectively the person who's leading the four horsemen, who in turn are leading the army of Amenth, right? So this person is basically Apocalypse's enemy, because we know that by virtue of the various swords and who's going to be fighting who, that Apocalypse is destined to fight this person. And when this person goes and removes their mask, we one, see the card of Apocalypse that says the lovers, and then two, it's Apocalypse's wife. It's Genesis. This means that during the tournament, Apocalypse is going to have to fight, and he's going to have to kill his wife. This is a bold move by Saturnine, because if it goes awry, say for example that Genesis is a turncoat, say for example that she's operating under this role but isn't actually allied with Amenth or her children, the four horsemen, and is actually working directly alongside Apocalypse. Because remember, they had that conversation before she went to the portal, prepare the world for what's coming. If she really has maintained her solitude all this time, and she really is a good guy all this time, then things could pop off fast. It could pop off so quickly and go south so astronomically fast, right? There's no telling what's gonna happen here. But I know it doesn't seem overly surprising. Like, I know it doesn't seem like this great big huge crazy grandiose event, but this right here could easily turn into the turn of the tide, and everything Saturnine's built could come crashing down. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.